It's BBC World News Today with me, Geetha Gurumuthy. The headlines. The battle for Aleppo, Syria's biggest city, is over. Thousands of people are being evacuated from the last rebel enclave under a deal to end years of fighting. President Assad describes it as a liberation.
History is being written today by every single citizen of Syria. We're not starting to write this history today. The start was 6 years ago when the war began.
A heroic battle against terrorism. We look at how Russian media is reporting the role of its forces in the war in Syria. Also coming up, reports from the US suggest that President Putin was directly involved in efforts to sway the election campaign. Donald Trump says he's not so sure. And a new era in fertility treatment. Britain becomes the first country to allow the creation of babies from the DNA of 3 people. Hello and welcome. The first convoy of evacuees from what's left of rebel-held Aleppo has arrived in opposition territory outside the city. The sick and wounded were first on board the convoy of buses and ambulances led by the Red Cross and Red Crescent. They moved from government-controlled territory in Aleppo, where they've been trapped for months now, into the nearby rebel-held areas. Well, rebel fighters and their families are due to follow. Those being evacuated are now headed for the neighbouring province of Idlib, most of which is controlled by a powerful rebel alliance. So far, only around 1,000 civilians have been moved, but it's thought that up to 50,000 people were trapped inside eastern Aleppo. Our Middle Eastern correspondent, Quentin Somerville, has this report.
The most desperate were the first to leave eastern Aleppo. The fear and the anxiety showed. Their rebellion is over, but before they reached relative safety, there was one final journey across enemy lines. The ambulances didn't get far.
As we prepared to evacuate civilians from besieged Aleppo, the ambulance convoy was shot at by regime forces. We're having to move so we don't get shelled or bombed.
And then panic as Syrian government jets flew overhead. People feared an attack. In the first convoy, the ambulance driver here was badly wounded, but he's now okay. One of his passengers, though, was killed. Hope is precarious here. The ceasefire had already collapsed once, but more buses set off and made it through. In the rebel-held countryside, on arrival they chanted, "Aleppo, we will be back."
The road was full of Russians, Iranians and Hezbollah fighters. There was no Syrian army at all. We left with honour and dignity. Aleppo was completely burned. Yesterday they bombed us with all kinds of weapons.
Here there was relief. Young and old, almost 1,000 made it out today. Among them, rebel fighters, their defeat all too apparent. As they left, they set alight their headquarters and fuel supplies. Aleppo again burned. The country's largest city is now back under government control.
History is being written today by every single citizen of Syria. We're not starting to write this history today. The start was 6 years ago when the war began.
And this is where the displaced will go, to rebel-held Idlib, where in already overstretched camps they're promising to make room.
When we heard that our trapped brothers in Aleppo were going to leave, we had a meeting, and because we don't have spare tents, we asked families to share so we could provide tents to our brothers from Aleppo. There are families and children.
You can't call this peace, but Aleppo was calm today. Tens of thousands of civilians remain inside. It will take weeks of convoys before they make it out. The city has fallen around them. Rebel commanders say it's defeat but not surrender, and that their opposition will continue far from here. Quentin Somerville, BBC News, Istanbul.
Well, our chief international correspondent Lise Doucet has the latest from Beirut.
It's such an extraordinary moment now, a decisive moment, a turning point in the war, which of course matters most of all to Syria, but it is a moment that is being watched around the world. The process of a pullout is being broadcast live on Syrian state television. It's being streamed live on a Russian military website. International news agencies also have their drones in the sky, watching every step of the way as what is the most significant battlefield success for President Assad's forces, as well as their Russian and Iranian allies. For the rebels who first seized territory in July 2012, where they truly believed that not just the world but history was on their side, are now suffering their most significant defeat, a surrender, a humiliating defeat for the rebels. And so today it was President Assad who called it history in the making, a victory, he said, which was beyond congratulations. But he and every other Syrian knows that this is just one point, even if it is a turning point in the war. All of the rebels who are leaving are going to fight another day from an opposition stronghold in the northwest in Idlib. Others are going further north where there are Kurdish fighters as well as Turkish troops. But there is a reflection today that as the opposition forces get progressively squeezed into smaller areas of the country, that the more Islamist, the more extremist forces will take a more commanding role. And of course, there is also the parallel war against the so-called Islamic State, which last week stole a march on Syrian troops and their Russian allies taking back the ancient city of Palmyra, and they're still advancing. So Syria's war will continue to push on, and given all that's happened in nearly 6 years, no one can be quite certain where it will be heading next.
Lise Doucette, and we'll be hearing from our correspondent in Moscow about how the battle for Aleppo is being reported there a little later in the programme. Let's look at some of the day's other news now. And Facebook is to give users new functions to try to prevent the spread of false news stories. The new tools will make it easier to flag fake articles to Facebook that appear in a news feed. The social network faced criticism for failing to stop a flood of bogus news articles during the United States election campaign. Rupert Murdoch's 21st Century Fox has agreed to buy European pay TV broadcaster Sky for $14.6 billion. Some shareholders had been sceptical about the bid, given the links between the boards of directors of Sky and 21st Century Fox. The deal may be referred to regulators to check it doesn't break the rules on media plurality. Hundreds of thousands of residents in the US city of Corpus Christi have been warned not to use tap water as it may be contaminated. Officials in Corpus Christi in Texas said an incident at an industrial area on Wednesday may have led to chemicals seeping into the water supply. People have been queuing to buy water, and some shops are reported to have sold out. The US media is reporting that the Russian President Vladimir Putin was directly involved in the hacking of the Democratic National Committee before the election last month. Well, we already know that US intelligence agencies believe that Russia is behind the hacks, but this is the first time that it's been alleged that the president himself was involved. Today's claims were published by several outlets, including our partners ABC News. The Kremlin has dismissed it as funny nonsense. And Donald Trump took to Twitter to express his scepticism, asking why these complaints are only being made now after Clinton lost. Well, our correspondent Gary O'Donoghue is in Washington. What proof is there, and will these hacked emails or claims of these hacked emails be declassified, as some there are calling for?
Well, I think there is now an investigation being conducted that was ordered by the White House about a week ago, and that will obviously try and establish exactly where the hacking came from, the extent of it as well. Donald Trump's particularly upset because he says this is a sort of sign of poor people regretting the result of the election and trying to undermine his victory in that sense. The concerns were voiced about this before the election, however. We do know back in October that there were the suggestions that the Russians were involved too. And of course the Democratic National Committee had its servers hacked, and that led to the resignation of the head of the DNC, Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Now, this thing will continue. There's a lot of pressure also in Congress for investigations, not just from Democrats, but from Republicans as well. So this thing's not going to go away. I don't think anyone's suggesting that the outcome of the election was affected in any significant way. The concern seems to be largely about the interference in the democratic process, and some people are saying we ought to get to the bottom of this. Others are saying this is a distraction.
Oh, and exactly that. My point following that is, why would the Clinton campaign not say that delegitimises the election result if one side of this election fight was effectively nobbled by an outside government? I mean, does that have any legal traction at all there or not?
I don't think you're going to hear that. I think you're going to hear much more about, much more concern about general interference in the democratic process. I don't think anyone would suggest that somehow it necessarily tipped the balance. There are other very, very big factors, don't forget, at play in this general election, not least, for example, things like the FBI investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails. That's something that the Clinton campaign think was of enormous significance so late in the campaign when that was reopened. Bear in mind there were all sorts of other factors in terms of the amount of money spent. Hillary Clinton spent a lot of money on advertising. So I think the hacking of a few emails, or even more than a few emails, I think not very many people, even on the Democratic side, are going to suggest that that actually changed the outcome.
OK, Gary O'Donoghue there in Washington. Thank you. Britain is to become the first country in the world to allow the creation of babies using 3 people's DNA. The fertility watchdog has approved the technique, which uses genetic material from a third person in order to prevent some inherited diseases. Clinics can now apply for a licence to perform the advanced form of IVF. Our medical correspondent Fergus Walsh has been to the lab in Newcastle, where the procedure was pioneered.
Imagine a baby being born with DNA from a man and 2 women. Hannah is a carrier for mitochondrial disease, an often devastating genetic disorder. She now has the chance of a healthy child. Paula is an egg donor, and many more women like her are needed.
My mother is severely affected by mitochondrial disease. She suffered strokes, epilepsy, diabetes and deafness. And as a carrier myself, I could pass that on to my baby, but now we have the option of having a baby and it not being passed on, which is absolutely amazing.
I donated 5 of my eggs for research here at Newcastle, and I've got the knowledge now that I'm helping couples, be able to have healthy children, and it's really fulfilling for me.
Mitochondria are the power packs of cells. They're always inherited from the mother's egg, and when faulty, it means deadly conditions can be passed on. To prevent that, this is how 3-person IVF will work. The nucleus containing the parent's key DNA would be removed, leaving behind the woman's faulty mitochondria. That nucleus is placed into a donor egg from a second woman which has had its key DNA removed and contains only healthy mitochondria. Any child born and future generations would have DNA from 3 people, although only 0.1% from the donor. All the genes that shape appearance and personality would come from the parents. Early next year, the medical team here in Newcastle say they'll be ready to treat the first couples. This is historic but controversial science. Critics will argue that what will happen in this lab is unethical, could be unsafe, and heralds a new era of babies created by design. But Parliament overwhelmingly approved the technique last year, and all the scientific reviews have said it should go ahead. Up to 25 couples a year could be helped, and the treatment will be funded by the NHS.
We believe that the technique will greatly enhance the chances of an affected woman having a healthy baby. And I think this will make an enormous difference to those women, because most of them, they can have babies, but they can't predict whether they will be healthy or seriously affected by disease.
How did it go?
No other country in the world has passed laws allowing 3-person IVF. Hannah and her fiancé Rob hope they will be among the first to be treated. Fergus Walsh, BBC News, Newcastle.
More now on our main story, the final battle for Aleppo. The support of the Russian military has been key to the success of the Assad government. And that means the way the civil war is being reported in Russia is often very different to in the West. Public opinion, too, sees the war in a very different light, as our Moscow correspondent Sarah Rainsford now reports.
On the ground in Syria, Russia's special forces, shown here for the first time on state television. The commentary is all about a heroic fight against terrorists. No mention here of any civilians caught up in the bloodshed. The soldiers identify targets for Russian bombers. For 15 months, those planes have conducted airstrikes that have reversed the fortunes of Bashar al-Assad. Russian firepower has been critical in his troops' recapturing of Aleppo. But it's also why the UN accuses Russia of a complete meltdown of humanity. And yet Vladimir Putin seems immune to such talk. Honouring a Russian soldier killed in the fight for Aleppo, his only condemnation was for those he calls terrorists.
For Russia, the conflict in Syria was always about projecting its power and influence. As the West stalled, Moscow moved in. The message to Russians here that they were helping to protect the world from terrorism. The message to the world that Russia under Vladimir Putin is a political and military power to be reckoned with.
As for brutal bombing campaigns, Russia has done that before. This is not Aleppo, but Grozny in Chechnya, a city flattened in what President Putin also called a war on terror. In this latest conflict, he's faced no calls at home for restraint.
This is a very important, almost final battle. And in the current situation, the winning side will not stop, whatever happens.
But with all the focus on Aleppo, this happened. Russian troops were forced to abandon their positions in Palmyra as militants from ISIS moved in. Recapturing this Syrian city was also once trumpeted by Russia as a great victory. Sarah Rainsford, BBC News, Moscow.
Investigators say that traces of explosives have been found on the remains of victims from an Egypt Air plane that crashed into the Mediterranean Sea in May. All 66 people on board flight MS-804 from Paris to Cairo were killed. The cause of the crash has remained unclear. The cockpit voice recorder showed that the pilots had battled to put out a fire. Well, aviation security analyst Julian Bray joins us now on a webcam. Thank you very much for your time. Just tell us what we've learned so far.
Well, basically what's happened is that they've actually recovered the bodies, and as a result of this, what has happened that they've actually found trace elements of explosive. And this means, in effect, that there must have been some kind of device on board the actual plane itself. Now, if this is actually the case, then, of course, we cannot rule out any act of terrorism. So the idea now is that they will start the formal criminal investigation. And as such, what will happen, they will use this evidence, they'll build evidence. They've already been down to the wreck site, which is 10,000 feet below the sea. So they had to recover the black box flight recorders from that depth, and they've analysed those, and they are beginning to put together a picture of what actually happened.
And why has it taken so long? It's months since this crash. And is it both the Egyptian and the French who are involved with the investigation?
Yes, because it went down in Egyptian airspace, even though it went down into the Mediterranean. And where it went down is 10,000 feet deep. And this is an area, the actual seabed was very level because it was receiving the silt from the River Nile. So it meant that the actual aircraft buried itself nose down deep into the silt. So they had to dig through this in order to recover the black boxes, and also, of course, to recover the remains.
So you say now that there will be a criminal investigation. What does that mean?
Well, it means that now they've actually got some tangible evidence that explosives were involved. You've got to realise that the wreck is 10,000 feet underwater, and the water pressure down there is very heavy indeed. So most of the evidence of explosives would have been washed away. However, the passengers unfortunately would have ingested some of the explosives, and this is what they've found. When they've done the autopsies, they've actually recovered fragments of explosives.
Okay.
And so that is what's happened.
Julian Bray, many thanks indeed for your time. We appreciate it. EU leaders will sit down to dinner in Brussels at the final summit of the year tonight, but the British Prime Minister Theresa May is not invited. That's because they'll be discussing how to handle Brexit negotiations once they get underway. It's also emerged that the UK's most senior diplomat in Brussels has privately warned the government that it could take 10 years to negotiate a post-Brexit trade deal with the EU. Our political editor Laura Kunsberg reports from Brussels.
Not much small talk between Theresa May and her travel companion today. Behind the tinted windows, alongside her in the official car, Sir Ivan Rogers, our top diplomat in Brussels.
Morning, Prime Minister. Morning.
As he tried to slip out while the attention was on the boss, they both knew this would be hard.
It's right that the other leaders prepare for those negotiations as we have been preparing. We will be leaving the EU. We want that to be as smooth and an orderly process as possible. It's not just in our interest, it's in the interest of the rest of Europe as well. Thank you.
Could it then take 10 years to get a deal?
10 years? He was trying to stay out of the way, but our ambassador to the EU told ministers in October the consensus here was that it might take as long as a decade to get a trade deal, and in the end, it might even fail. To avoid that, Britain needs friends.
Will it take 10 years for Britain to get a trade deal with the rest of the EU?
10 years? I hope it will be a lot less. I understand how difficult it will be for her to negotiate because, of course, she will be negotiating practically against 27.
Not only trade deal, the whole Brexit negotiations will be so very complex.
As one minister said, it's very, very difficult to establish how long it will take, and very difficult for leaders to find much in common with one and then another. When Britain has voted to leave them all behind. Downing Street says again and again, ministers are confident of doing a deal on a 2-year timetable, the clock starting to tick by the end of March. But it's so complicated. Many, including in government, expect a fallback plan, a transitional arrangement for business to be put in place.
The suggestion is not that it will be 10 years before we leave the EU machine, but that it might take as long as a decade to do a trade deal with the rest of the EU, to work out how we do business after we leave. Ministers want to be more optimistic. They claim it can happen much faster. But are they sticking their fingers in their ears? There's a sense here in Brussels at least that we're already on the outside.
Isolated? Well, Theresa May still gets a place around the table for these talks about Syria, security and defence. But the Prime Minister won't be invited to the dinner table later, when all the rest will work out their tactics for the Brexit talks. But Theresa May's position is not down to banter and backslapping. Yet if she was ever in any doubt, it can be lonely at the top. Laura Kunsberg, BBC News, Brussels.
Now, the Hogmanay celebrations in Edinburgh are world famous, not least because of the spectacular firework display that heralds the new year. But could that be about to change? After complaints about the noise made by the display, the city is considering whether silent fireworks could be the answer. Stephen Godden reports.
Princes Street at midnight on Hogmanay. And imagine the celebrations on mute. For the organisers, it's an unthinkable prospect.
We build the 3-day programme around the midnight moment. The visitors that are coming here for those celebrations are coming here because of the world-class fireworks that we produce. So Edinburgh just wouldn't be Hogmanay without the Hogmanay fireworks.
There is no such thing as a silent firework, but if you look hard enough you can find a low-noise alternative like this, manufactured to produce all of the colour but without the bang.
Disneyland Paris have used them on a grand scale following noise complaints from nearby villagers. So would those living in Scotland's capital welcome something similar?
I think the whole point of fireworks are to be noisy and kind of visual, so
don't really know why anyone would want to go to a silent fireworks display.
For the pets and things like that, silent, if they can do silent fireworks, I think that would be a good idea.
Luna does not like fireworks at all. She gets really nervous.
But are councillors at risk of spoiling the fun?
It's about keeping the spectacle and minimising the impact. And silent fireworks might be one answer, light displays, laser displays, maybe a second answer. We only will become a Scrooge if we choose to think of it like that. If we're forward thinking and we take this as an opportunity, we could do amazing things.
A report is expected in the spring. Before then, a global audience will once again witness the sound and fury of Hogmanay, undimmed, for now at least. Stephen Godden, BBC News, Edinburgh.
I'm going to be in Spain for New Year's Eve. I'm not quite sure what's going to be happening there. I imagine it's not going to be that quiet though. I am on Twitter at Geetha Gurumuthy. Do stay in touch. You can see what we're looking at via Facebook too at facebook.com/BBC World News. I'm Geetha Gurumuthy. I am back with the headlines very soon and back on Sunday as well for those of you on BBC World News. Bye bye.